Yes, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, my lord. Have you received a copy of the second affidavit of Dr. Weldon?
I have. I'm just at paragraph 7. Let me just read it. Yes, thank you.
My lord, yes. I mean, again, in view of the public interest on this matter and the comments that have been made,
Yes.
I do propose to just read a couple of paragraphs from this.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So, my lord, this, for the record, is the second affidavit of Dr. Cc Weldon sworn today. And further to paragraph 3, it is in response to a question, my lord, that you posed, in response to a question that my learned friend, Mr. Pettingill, posed by reference to an article in the Royal Gazette entitled 5 New COVID-19 Cases as Active Infections Rise to 15, published on the same day. That information, as Dr. Weldon states, was based on the information provided by the Ministry of Health on the 6th of July, 2021. Paragraph 4, the Chief Justice asked how many of the 5 travelers who tested positive for the virus that causes COVID-19 referred to by the Ministry of Health were vaccinated. In answer to the Chief Justice's question, 4 out of the 5 travelers referred to by the Ministry of Health who tested positive on the virus that causes COVID-19 were vaccinated. However, that number requires context. Paragraph 5, as stated in my first affidavit, the data and scientific evidence is clear that there is significant reduction in the rate of infection and the rate of transmission in vaccinated persons compared to unvaccinated persons. Paragraph 6, since June the 20th, 97.5% of travelers to Bermuda have been fully vaccinated, and only 2.5% of travelers arriving to Bermuda are unvaccinated. This means that there are approximately 40 times more fully vaccinated travelers to Bermuda than unvaccinated travelers. Based on pure mathematics, it is expected that more fully vaccinated persons would test positive, as there is a substantially larger pool. If there was no effective vaccination, we would expect 40 times more cases. Based on vaccines scientifically proven to work, we expect this number to be far less. Paragraph 7, out of 11,376 airport arrivals where the vaccination status is known between June 20, 2021 and July 7, 2021, A, in relation to travelers arriving who are fully vaccinated, the total fully vaccinated arrivals was 11,094 arrivals. Out of that total of 11,094 arrivals, 6 were positive on arrival or became positive after arrival. As such, 0.05% of fully vaccinated persons have tested positive for the virus that causes COVID-19 on or after arrival into Bermuda. B, in relation to travelers arriving who are unvaccinated, the total of unvaccinated arrivals was 282. Out of that total, 3 were positive on arrival or became positive after arrival. As such, 1.06% of unvaccinated persons have tested positive for the virus that causes COVID-19 on or after arrival. Paragraph 8, the above data confirms that since June 20, 2021, an unvaccinated passenger is 19.6 times more likely to test positive on or after arrival than a fully vaccinated passenger. For reference, if the unvaccinated and vaccinated were equally alike to test positive for the virus that causes COVID-19, based on the rate of unvaccinated positive cases observed, this would equate to 118 cases of vaccinated travelers that would be expected in the same time period. We have in fact seen 6. Paragraph 9, and my lord, this is a significant paragraph. Based on the data, I can also confirm that since May the 3rd, 2021, not a single arriving traveler that has arrived in Bermuda that is fully vaccinated has transmitted the infection to any other person in Bermuda. The only transmission event has been from an unvaccinated person.
Yes.
My lord, that is the response to the inquiry that my learned friend, Mr. Pettingill, has made, and we hope that that has resolved the issue. My lord, if I can now try and conclude my submissions.
Yes.
We are on paragraph 63. My lord, let me just say by way of introduction some final points I want to make. First of all, with respect to reasonably justifiable, I have mentioned this, but we say that the court should ensure that the burden and the applicants know that the burden is on them to discharge that portion of the test in Benavides and the case of Richardson and Rayner. My lord, and we are not saying that that is merely an evidential burden. It's a legal burden. It's a legal burden, a full legal burden. So it's not just a shifting of the evidence.
Yes.
Point number 2, when we turn to section 11 of the Constitution and the burden that is imposed upon the respondents, in section 11, 11.2a, we rely on all our submissions in support of our firm assertion that we have discharged that burden on all limbs of the De Freitas test.
Yes.
Now, my lord, we say, and this is a matter that you have to determine, that with respect to the applicants, they have a burden of not only satisfying the test that is imposed upon them to demonstrate, according to section 11 of the Constitution, that it was not reasonably justifiable for these measures to be in place. We say that, but we also say that they have to satisfy the fourth limb of the Bank-Mellett test.
Yes.
My lord, if you have if you have the Bank Mellet case, if I can just take you to that very quickly, I think you can find the reference, the appropriate reference at paragraph 20.
Bank Mellet, paragraph 20. Yes, I have it.
And you see that there's a reference to the Lord Sumption's four-limb test, which he culls in part from the Freitas, and then the fourth limb is whether, having regard to these matters and to the severity of the consequences, a fair balance has been struck between the rights of the individual and the interests of the community. And you'll recall from my submissions yesterday, my lord, that
Yes.
you recall from my submissions yesterday that this is what the text Saunders says, that if you have a two-part reasonably required, reasonably justifiable test in the constitutional provision, then the second limb, the reasonably justifiable in a democratic society, that limb is not only imposed upon the applicant, but that limb is also subject to the proportionality test, which is this Part 4 test.
Yes.
What does that mean in context? What does the paragraph 20 stage 4 test mean as imposed upon the applicant? Well, first of all, we accept that the nature of the infringement is an important one, the infringement on the right to freedom of movement. But it has to be seen not as an abstract, it has to be seen in context. And in the abstract, it does sound and carry the import of a breach worthy of sanction. But what we actually have, as I've discussed before, my lord, is a 3-month period between now and the date in section 14.2 of the regulations, when the order will expire, the 30th of September. And what has to be balanced, and I'm not making my learned friend's argument here, he will have to make it if he assumes that burden to disprove the reasonably justifiable element. We have on the other side of the scale, we have the requirement to quarantine for 14 days if the applicant chooses to travel internationally. So they're not barred from traveling. And I accept the Constitution does say a right to enter and depart the island. But we have to balance these two considerations: the length of the restriction, the purpose behind the restriction to try and protect and save lives, and the fact that it is for a short period. So we say that if you weigh the nature of the restriction against the totality of the evidence, it would be wrong to say that the balance is in favor of exposing the public to the threat of the virus and or new variants coming into the island.
Yes.
Lord, I'm not going to read out the submissions under relief sought. They are there. They deal with the discretion you have with respect to declaratory relief, but it's there in the event that you believe that that's an issue to deal with. But what I am going to deal with finally, my final 2 points, is, my Lord, and I'm going to return to this. You have invited, my learned friend, and I think that it is incumbent for the court to know, and in fact, we would like to know, whether, based on the pleaded case, what is being challenged is justiciable. What is being challenged is the statement of the Minister of National Security. There is no clear indication that the applicants are challenging anything else. Lord, the pleadings demonstrate they're not even challenging a statement by the Minister of Health. Now, my Lord, to put this in its public law context and its declaratory relief context, there was potentially an argument that could have been made at the interlocutory stage about prematurity. Because had they waited to see exactly what the order was, they would then have known, and the court would have known, which portions of the order they are or aren't challenging. Right now, it's been done off the back of a statement made by the Minister of National Security that they have then extrapolated forward with no pleaded case to make various allegations. That puts the court, if I may say so, my Lord, in a very difficult position, because the originating summons, the affidavit, and the oral submissions, you'll recall, my Lord, during the course of the oral submissions of the applicant, they didn't go through the order. So the question is for the court, and I respectfully say for my learned friend, what is being challenged as justiciable in this case?
Yes.
And the last point I want to make is this, my Lord. Again, and I say candidly, my Lord, if I can ask you to turn to tab 1 of the authorities bundle. It's the Constitution. My Lord, I say this candidly. It's not necessarily an attractive point to make, but it is a point that has to be made. It's with respect to the issue of whether or not the applicants have demonstrated that they are being hindered. And I make it for this reason. Lord, if you look at section 15 of the Constitution, in the first sentence, it says, section 15(1), if any person alleges any of the foregoing provisions of this chapter has been or is being or is likely to be contravened, then without prejudice to any other action with respect to the same matter which is lawfully available, that person may apply to the Supreme Court for redress. Now, my Lord, That is the standing point. Now, you will see that the standing point is rather a lower threshold than the right of action point, which we'll come to shortly in section 11. The words are has been, is being, or is likely to be. Now, my lord, on one view, you may take a position that they've probably satisfied the standing point. It's a matter entirely for you. But when you turn to section 11, which is not a standing point, it's a right of action point, it says, except with his consent, no person shall be hindered in the enjoyment of his freedom of movement. And that is why we say that in the context of this case, if the applicants were saying, I am traveling, they could say they are being hindered, or I want to travel. But if they are saying, I may travel, does that equate to shall be hindered? And in our view, it does not. It doesn't reach the threshold. And I don't think this court should confuse the standing test with the hindrance test. And my lord, I'll leave it for you, and no doubt my learned friend will reply on this, but it is something you have to address, particularly in light of what Mr. Justice Hellman said in paragraph 34 and 35 of the Benavides case.
Yes, I'll have a look.
Lord, unless I can be of any further assistance, those are my submissions.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Pettingill?
Pleasure, my lord. I'm obliged to my friend, and I'm obliged to him for the provision of the affidavit from his expert. And I'll just touch on that briefly, if I may, my lord. I think it came as somewhat perhaps a surprise to the court yesterday, and to perhaps to my friend, that I suggested on the basis of that report that it appeared that 4 out of 5 of the recent cases tested positive were in fact of vaccinated people. And I'm obliged for your lordship making the order that be addressed, because we perhaps wouldn't have not had that information, which I say with regard to this issue is highly, highly relevant, because of the fact, my lord, this is a border control case. The whole premise for the government imposing these provisions relates to travelers entering into Bermuda.
Well, it's a border control issue in the context of transmission of COVID.
Yes.
Look at paragraph 9 of the affidavit.
But my lord, I've seen, I have it here. Yes.
Well, I mean, it is important. I mean, the evidence is that not a single vaccinated person who has been infected, who has entered Bermuda, has infected anyone else.
Yeah,
that is important in the context of this case.
I think that is certainly an important point in the context of this case, my lord. I would think your lordship would find, I would find it with greatest respect surprising if your lordship didn't see it as important that we've just had 4 out of 5 vaccinated people that have tested positive that have been roaming around.
Mr. Pettingill, we've had a lot of expert evidence, and there is no contrary evidence to this. The evidence is that the infected persons have low viral load, with the result that they do not infect. And that's the evidence. You have not filed any contrary evidence. And in that context, what is the point of saying that as a matter of theoretical analysis, you can have a situation where the fully vaccinated people can be infected and can enter the island? The question is, can they transmit virus to the residents?
Yes, I mean, I think that it's accepted that to some degree that they potentially can transmit if they are infected positive. I accept to not the same degree. On
But
the
you have the evidence. We have to deal with evidence.
yes, I said
You have the evidence of the person who is expert in these matters, who says and gives you the figures of people who have been fully vaccinated and not fully vaccinated, and have entered Bermuda and have been infected. She's given you the rates, and the punchline is that not a single person who was infected but who was fully vaccinated has transmitted that to anybody else.
and I think that's very fortunate that that is the case, my lord. I
So
mean,
that's a science.
that's a science. One has to then beg the question as to why in all of these other jurisdictions that when it has come to a mandatory quarantine position, they've vaccinated both unvaccinated and vaccinated people. And one would logically have to assume that on the science and all of the reports that we've seen, that there's a reason for that. And I would say that the quite pellucid reason is that there is a concern and a risk that vaccinated people, and your Lordship made this point this morning, depending particularly from what jurisdiction they may arise from, if it's a red zone or whatever, may well be at a risk of transmitting the vaccine. I'm going to come to this shortly, because I note with the report of Dr. Peden, I think it is, on the second dose, she's saying 79% effective with regard to the Delta variant, which still leaves a 20% risk factor. So clearly, in my respectful submission, all of these other jurisdictions, which are mentioned here, which are mentioned by the respondents, where there is quarantine, which is not the issue here. Nobody has an issue with quarantine, as I've said. Where there is quarantine, have vaccinated both, sorry, my lord, have quarantined both the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. And all I would say with respect is that this
discussed this morning that the United Kingdom is taking a view that those who are vaccinated, certainly as far as the green and the amber countries are concerned, need do nothing more.
I pulled that down and obliged your lordship, because I think it was also that as far as the green goes, it's the unvaccinated also don't have to quarantine at this juncture. It's the
amber.
Yes, amber does. But my lord, that comes to the point of reasonableness, doesn't it? I mean, I mean, these other jurisdictions have cited, and this is the approach that has sensibly been taken. It's not a blanket covering of just saying, it's certainly not a blanket covering of saying everybody who's unvaccinated has to go into a mandatory quarantine. There are what one could see as reasonable, I'll use that term because that's the term that's required. There are reasonable positions with regard to how you pigeonhole particular elements of travel. And the reason has to be that there is a concern, 20%, I would say, on the basis of the Delta variant, that people who are vaccinated are at some degree of risk, particularly depending on where they come from, of transmission to other people. That's all that the science is, in my view, is what it's telling us.
Before we forget, can we actually pin down what exactly you're challenging?
Yes, my lord. Obliged for that, because I think that's important. Obviously, what the initial
Can we have a look at the document which started these proceedings, your originating summons, and see what it is that you are challenging before this court?
I mean, my lord, my friend raises the question with regard to whether this is judiciable. But there are key points to be made on this. At the time of the application being made on the expedited originating summons, it was with a view to the intention of the government and what they intended to implement by way of quarantine restrictions.
And can you get a declaration in relation to intentions?
Well, I would say, my lord, when it comes to constitutional rights, that obviously with respect, it's clear that a broad interpretation has to be given in accordance with Section 1 to ensuring that those rights are protected. And
let me ask you clearly. Yeah. Your case is that you can get a declaration if a minister of the Crown says that I intend to propose legislation to do ABC.
And then they do it, yes. especially as it didn't come into law until last Friday. I mean, whether it becomes a question of, and in those circumstances, I would say it relates to the Constitution, that to have to be in a position of the protection of the enshrined rights of Section 1 not being able to be protected because the government has indicated that they are going to do something, which with respect is the time to take the action, and then they actually do it, that is entirely something that the court has to have regard to by way of constitutional protection. And I would say that's it.
What are you asking me to declare illegal today?
That the position with regard to, well, it follows one after the other. If it was a position that the intention of the government was something to be illegal, then they shouldn't have done it. So that would make the actual action illegal.
Which legislation, which section you're asking me to declare as unlawful?
My lord, it's section 11, like section 11(1), 2.
No, I understand that, but which piece of legislation you're saying is unconstitutional?
Oh, it's the regulations that came into effect on Friday, right? Which were by negative resolution, which were not put through the House.
Can you show me precisely which provision you want me to focus on?
With regard to the regs, my lord?
Yes.
Yeah. If I have that in front of me, actually, my lord.
Well, I mean, that's the basis of your application.
Sorry, my lord. Sorry. No, it's not in that one. It is, my lord, and I'm not sure that they are included with respect in the bundle and the recent pleadings.
We just looked at them this morning, but
I'm sorry?
I thought Mr. Duncan took me through them.
Tab 3. They're in tab
3.
I apologize.
Is this the legislation you are challenging, Mr. Pettingill?
My lord, I'm afraid I still haven't laid my hands on it with regard to tab 3.
Is tab 3 of my Mr. Duncan's authorities?
Tab 3. No. I'm afraid I don't have that at tab 3, my lord. I don't know where I've gone awry.
This is the same tab 3. This is the summons as well.
Yeah. My lord, I don't have the regs at the tab 3. I don't know. I can't explain why that is not the case.
Well, can you just tell me which part of those regulations you want me to declare as invalid?
My lord, it's the regulatory provision that relates to mandatory quarantine for unvaccinated people on arrival in Bermuda.
So that will be regulation paragraph 13.
Paragraph 13. Thank you, my lord. Yes.
No, I'm not telling you. I'm asking you. You have to tell me your case.
And I'm agreeing. I appreciate that, my lord. And I'm saying that is the regulation that was being challenged. I concede that the initial application related to the statement of policy by the minister, and that what transpired was that then one would hope then became the law, I believe, as of Friday when it was put through the House. And as your lordship has heard me indicate, it is with respect somewhat narrowed down in that the application relates solely to that issue as to whether it is in breach of what we say are the constitutional rights of the applicants with regard to section 11 and their freedom of movement. My lord, and also whether the government has the right in accordance with section 11.2 to restrict that freedom of movement on the basis that it is reasonably required.
Are you going to address the issue of how the court should approach this as has been presented by Mr.
I am indeed, and I'm obliged. And I'm pleased to say also that I think that let me just pull that back if I may, Lord. My lord, so I would, with respect to my learned friend's submissions, and I'm looking at paragraph 17 particularly, I will concur with the approach in Benavides and the ruling of Justice Hellman.
So that is different from what your leader was saying. He was saying that Benavides was irrelevant because it was a trade union case.
Well, what I've seen, I've as one does, I've parachuted now into this in this position, and having looked at that and heard my learned friend's position with regard to it, and looking at it in light of the Bermuda Constitution, I, with respect, I'm not in a position to.
So I should discard what Mr. Griffith said in relation to that case.
I don't join ad item, my lord, having heard my learned friend on the position.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, I have a duty to do that, having heard what the position is with regard to the appropriate test. I would say this, my lord, it does not, with respect, remove from the fact that the court.
Just before you go, I mean, I think I have to just go slightly deeper in there. Do you agree with the shifting of the burdens which Mr. Duncan took the court through?
Well, that is embraced by Benavides, my lord, and I would say that perhaps it is more that particular case, and this is where I would join with what Mr. Griffiths was saying on this, was an application with regard to section 10, whereas this is a section 11 freedom of movement application to be considered. So there is that subtle difference with regard to what the issues are. But the starting point certainly has to be that the umbrella position, if you will, of the Constitution is, if we look at 11.2, is the clear test, where my friend accepts quite rightly, and on the basis of Benavides as well, that it is for the defendant to establish that the restrictions on the freedom of movement are reasonably required. I don't disagree with the position that there may well be a shift with regard to an argument that flows from that, but I'm not so sure as to the significance as to how it arises in this particular case on freedom of movement position. Because if your lordship were to be with us in relation to that position as relates to freedom of movement, having accepted that it was a hindrance, then that would be effectively the end of the matter. If it were to kick back,
Why do you say that would be the end of the matter?
Well, because at that stage, if your lordship were finding that it was sorry, if your lordship was saying that it was not reasonably required, is what I meant to say.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you used the word hindrance. You heard what Mr. Duncan said in relation to the hindrance point. Do you have any submissions about that?
Oh, my lord, with respect, I think that it is beyond refute that any applicant, and we saw this in the case of Ferguson comes to mind, my lord, on same-sex marriage. Mr. Ferguson did not have, and the point arose there, as I recall, Mr. Ferguson did not have a partner at the time, was not engaged to be married in a same-sex couple relationship. It was his hope that one day he would meet somebody and that he would be able to marry. And that was deemed to be a position that he had certainly the right to ensure that that right was preserved. I see that as being the same position here with regard to hindrance, my lord, because it is not a question of, and it would have been easy enough with some colorful artifice for applicants to go out and buy tickets and say they had to travel. What has been made clear is that they wish to have the desire to be able to travel. And I would submit, my lord, that on a constitutional basis, in reading it with the fundamental rights contained within Section 1, that fundamental rights have to be able to be exercisable. And one doesn't have to demonstrate with respect that you have an immediate intention to exercise those rights. They just have to be a right that you have the freedom to exercise should you choose to do so. And that includes your protection of freedom of movement with regard to Section 11. So when one speaks of shall, that's what it means to. If I want to be able to travel unhindered, I have the right to do that. Once the state indicates or imposes a restriction to that freedom, I would respectfully submit that I am then hindered in the ability to exercise that freedom of movement. So
does it make any difference that the order will expire in any event at the end of September?
I just, with the greatest respect, my lord, I don't, and with the greatest respect to my learned friends' arguments on that, I would say absolutely not. I've never really understood why there was any significance to that, because it's the same as with regard to any type of freedom. If it's hindered today, then it is entirely something that is hindered. And one has to take it as it is at the time. The fact there's a sunset clause on it sometime down the road should not by any means obviate the position that the right is being hindered. The right to exercise that is being hindered as of today. And we've seen, my lord, these regulations have changed all of the time with regard to the COVID provisions. So I would say it's no more than optimistic that it will come to a close on September 30th. And we can't, with respect, when it comes to enshrined rights, say that they're not hindered on the basis of the optimism that that position isn't going to change. And one is effectively hopeful that things will run a certain course. We've already seen that they don't necessarily run that course, which is understandable. So the fact that the September 30th date looms out there, in my view, is not any saving position with regard to the fact that the applicants are hindered. Should there be a family emergency, let's say, or something like that, they've already indicated with regard to traveling to see children, where they wish to travel tomorrow, they would have the right to do that. Something may come up where they need to do that. And as it currently stands, our position is that their freedom of movement would be hindered.
Yes.
I don't think I got anything further to that, my lord, but I think that is it makes with respect eminent sense. My lord, having accepted the position on the test. I think it's important now because, again, my friend, I tend to be ad item on this. It's just a different view with regard to approach in looking at the position on Phillips and Scott ministers at paragraph 104. My Lord, can I just take a moment to fix my Zoom position? I keep getting pop-ups which are disturbing, and I don't know why. And I think I can just turn those off, if I may.
You should.
Thank you so much. If you can just take a moment. I think I fixed it, my Lord.
Good.
Yeah, I apologize.
So you see the Scottish ministers.
The Scottish ministers case, which
Paragraph 104.
thank you, my Lord. Yeah. So 104, my Lord. The question at this stage of the test is whether a less intrusive measure than closing a place of worship or pen of criminal sanction could have been used without unacceptably compromising the achievement of the objective of maintaining public health and preserving life by reducing the risk of infection from coronavirus. And I think the question in relation to the term without unacceptably compromising for the court is, does quarantine at home necessarily do that, as opposed to quarantining in a hotel? Is it unacceptably compromising? I think the evidence, my Lord, and I'll come to it with regard to Dr. Pete and so on, seems to certainly raise the argument that it may be compromising with regard to staying at a hotel and being locked away or staying at home. If we look at Scottish ministers, I think the question for the court and for your lordship is to consider whether it is unacceptably compromising, not just whether it is compromising. And I would say to that, my Lord, and I'll come to all of the other measures, and I'll come to discussion about the evidence of the other measures, because I would say that they're already in existence. It's not for the applicants to establish those. My learned friend mentioned this with regard to the evidence. I'm going to indicate to the court that it is already there. If, my Lord, it were to be the position that quarantine at home were unacceptably compromising, one has to beg the rhetorical question, why wasn't it implemented a year ago or many, many months ago, or at the time that it became a concern? Certainly, we've seen that the government has the power to, by negative resolution, get regulations through, to their credit, to the entire credit of Parliament and to the government, as needed, as required. That hasn't happened in this case.
So Mr. Duncan, in relation to this issue, is relying upon the evidence of the Minister of Health.
Yes.
Looked at the paragraphs. He's relying upon the affidavit of the Premier.
Yeah.
He's relying upon the passages out of the affidavit of the Chief Health Officer.
Yeah.
The medical officer, and he's relying on Professor Peden. What evidence are you relying upon in relation to this issue, which you say contradicts it?
Well, I'm going to come to our.
Well, let's do it now.
Okay.
Can you just show me what evidence I should take into account when I'm taking the view as to what the evidence is in relation to this issue?
We can do that now, my Lord. Can I park Scottish ministers for a moment, my Lord, because I want to come back with respect and go through 105 ultimately.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, thank you so much. If I can just have a moment to find. So we have three affidavits in response, my lord, from Aaron Evans, Dr. Dowling, and Dr. Osseran. Perhaps I could start with the affidavit of Dr. Dowling.
Yes. Now, tell me the qualifications of Dr. Dowling in relation to infectious diseases.
Well, my lord, he sets out at the beginning of his affidavit with regard to his specialty. I can see it is with family medicine.
Yes.
And he makes the affidavit, my lord, of course, he is a medical doctor, and makes the affidavit on the basis of his professional opinion on the government's decision to go with mandatory hotel quarantine.
But this is a specialist area of the public health. I mean, what qualification does he have in relation to infectious diseases affecting the community, and what community action should be taken?
Well, my lord, I think that as a doctor, and with regard to a family doctor, he obviously has the medical qualifications to consider the basis of other doctors' opinions in the community that may cause a spread. And I should say this, that the points that he raises with regard to the
let's stick to I want you to stick to qualifications, because you're asking me to accept him as an expert in the field of public health,
Yes.
specifically in relation to the spread of coronavirus. Now, you tell me what qualification he has to express the views he does.
Well, my lord, other than those that are set out here, I wouldn't go as far with respect to saying that he is a specialist in infectious diseases. That's not what his affidavit is here for. He is a specialist in family medicine and has a medical license to practice in Bermuda, and is obviously somebody who is, because of his practice, has been keenly focused and aware with regard to what is transpiring in relation to coronavirus. Not that he's an infectious disease expert.
Well, I'll take it under advisement as to whether he is qualified.
As
an expert to express the opinions in relation to these matters.
Obliged, my lord. Well, in that regard, perhaps we could turn to page 2 of his affidavit and consider what it is that he's saying with regard to, and I think this is the key, with regard to the actions of the government in creating a mandatory quarantine for unvaccinated people.
Yes, so which paragraph you want me to look at?
Paragraph 8, my lord.
8.
He refers to Dr. Weldon's affidavit and the discussion of COVID infection and how the vaccine has been used in Bermuda to reduce these infections. At 9, he references that she also discussed the variants which have been identified on the island and the number of vaccinated versus unvaccinated, which has been identified to have these specific variants. It should be noted that since the 3rd of June, the majority of the variants have been Beta and Delta strains, which follow similar patterns in other countries. If this pattern holds for the future, the Delta variant will become the dominant strain seen. Going by table 2, that means half of those strains identified were found in vaccinated people. I mean, that's just an observation as a medical practitioner with regard to the data that's provided by Dr. Weldon. My lord, at 10, Dr. Weldon's last point was the need to reach herd immunity in order to prevent the virus from continuing to spread in the community. Based on her calculations, Bermuda would need 87.5% of the community to be immune to the Delta strain to reach herd immunity. At 11, he says, Dr. Weldon's initial statement in paragraph 28 with herd immunity resulted from those that are vaccinated. However, a reference at number 23 stated herd immunity came from vaccination and recovery from infection. Bermuda does not recognize that they have been previously infected as immune, although the most recent data suggests that immunity does occur and lasts as long as a vaccine. My lord, that's just an expression of a medical practitioner in the area that he practices in, observing the fact that there is no data that relates to the immunity element of people that have recovered from COVID vaccine. And there's a considerable amount of those, as we're aware, an extremely considerable amount, if not a couple of thousand people, if I'm right on what the data is, that have indeed recovered and would consequently have a degree of immunity that's not worked into the figures. He takes the point, my lord, that this lack of recognition makes our recorded herd immunity lower than it actually is. Whereas other countries will consider vaccinated or previously infected as equivalent, Bermuda still requires those previously infected to get vaccinated before they're considered immune and eligible to receive the benefits of recognized immunity.
So this argument he's presenting here is argument you could present. I mean, there's no specialization in this.
Well, Lord, as somebody who's been keenly following it, I'd like to think that I could certainly make those observations. I think that coming from a medical practitioner, indicating and understanding what those particular terms are and what they mean and how they impact on the numbers is more significant than I would be able to just make the argument. As much as I like to think of myself as having any degree of medical knowledge. Well, Lord, the points laid out do not address how quarantining at home, and I think this is the key, again, it's another observation, but I think it's an important observation coming from a medical practitioner who's having to consider this position with regard to his family patients about whether they should be in quarantine or not. I mean, that is something where he, like any medical practitioner in the family field, would have the degree of required expertise.
No, Mr. Pettingham, we're concerned with the issue of compliance as to whether if you have people, ask people to quarantine at home, whether the rate of compliance is sufficiently lower than would be the case if they were in a government mandated quarantine in a hotel designated by the government. And that's the issue. And people have expertise to express views in relation to that issue. What expertise does he have and what opinion does he express?
Well, that, my lord, is contained in his analysis on page 4 of Dr. Peden.
Let's just look at what he says in paragraph 13. He says that the points laid out do not address how quarantining at home versus in a government facility changes any of our concerns. More concerning is from her table 2, if Bermuda acknowledges that vaccinated people are capable of bringing the Delta variant into Bermuda, why would they treat them differently than the unvaccinated? He obviously is not addressing the issue that those who are vaccinated have less viral load and less likely to transmit. Then he says this, the previous outbreak was blamed on one person, not because of their vaccination status, but because of their illegal actions. What is he saying here?
My lord, with respect, I read that as saying, going back to the Minister of Health's position, I think the Premier also, that one person may have been the cause of a significant outbreak because they didn't adhere to lockdown or quarantine provisions before the time
The minister was making the point. The minister was making the point that because the quarantine was at home and not at a government mandated hotel, it was possible for that person to leave, and he left on day 12 and went to a party and infected a lot of people. Yes. Now, here is a professional, an expert in public who holds himself as an expert in public health. In response to that, he's giving this opinion. The previous outbreak was blamed on one person, not because of their vaccination status, but because of their illegal activities. How does that answer the issue as to the level of compliance if you're quarantining at home or at government mandated hotels?
Well, my lord, I think I commented on this yesterday with regard to the fact that the people that were inclined to commit illegal actions were probably going to, commit them in any event, whether you had them, at home or you had them in a hotel position. I think that's the only simple point that's being made there, as far as I can read it, my lord, that he's saying that a person, it is down to the fact that they committed this illegal action, not as to whether they were vaccinated or not. The vaccine wasn't even.
We're not concerned with whether a person commits an illegal action or a legal action. We are the focus of this inquiry is the transmission of virus. That's what we're looking at, and it's completely irrelevant whether you categorize the conduct as legal, illegal, irresponsible, or purely negligent.
Perhaps the next line assists somewhat, my lord, and then he goes on to say, treating vaccinated people like they pose no risk sets up another potential release of the variant into the population. And I note the wording there, my lord, and it applies perhaps to today's statistics that we receive. What is being said is that there is the potential, and I said this yesterday, and I said it with respect to the gaming thing of it's a crapshoot, because there's no question that there is still the percentage chance that a person.
Mr. Pettingill, we looked at a number of studies, and we can you can go back and you can look at them yourselves. Yeah. They all say that in relation to the vaccinated persons, even if they get infected, the viral load is substantially less, with the result that the prospects of infecting other people is either completely eliminated or substantially eliminated as a statistical exercise. And that's the issue which Dr. Dowling refuses to confront and refuses to tackle. And what I'm looking from you is in relation to this issue, what scientific evidence do you rely upon? I mean, we have seen the scientific evidence exhibited to the affidavit of Dr. Weldon, the chief medical officer, the Dr. Peaton, but in relation to this issue of the viral load, we've seen the studies. What studies is Dr. Dowling relying upon? In relation
he does not exhibit any study per se, my lord. He addresses the.
How can I, in that case, how should I view his opinion when we have opinion from other experts who have specialized in this area of public health and virus transmission, and in support of their opinions have exhibited scientific papers, current scientific papers by their expert community and people who are established in that area, which seem to speak with one voice. On what basis I should reject that?
Well, my lord, no, I don't think. I think that we are, again, it comes back to the fact I think that we are ad item on a lot of the science, where we seem to not be ad item is on the basis as what is the government doing? Is it reasonably required? And my rhetorical question, I think that I'm capable of answering this and not being a medical expert, is why would all of these other countries and jurisdictions that are cited that have a form of quarantine, be it at a hotel or not, require that both vaccinated and unvaccinated people undergo the quarantine? And the government scientific evidence speaks to that. All of these studies, my lord, when they're speaking of quarantine, are not, and this is the dividing line, are not speaking of the mandatory quarantine of unvaccinated people. That is where Bermuda seems to have made, if you will, the quantum leap to let's just go with unvaccinated. They cite all of these other jurisdictions. Your lordship mentioned today, New Zealand, Cayman. I went and looked at the provisions with regard to Cayman this afternoon, the UK, everywhere else. And they talk about all of the things that your lordship is saying with regard to the science. And we are in large part in agreement with those things. I have certainly not, by way of submission or by way of affidavits from anyone, endeavored to undermine the seriousness of COVID-19, the fact that the vaccines certainly have an important position with regard to preventing people from catching the disease and spreading the disease, although there's still, as we've seen, in significant cases, the fact that they can in fact catch and transmit, All of those things are accepted. The one dividing line, and the one clear, unequivocal dividing line, is that the scientific approach on the basis of the government's evidence has been that both vaccinated and unvaccinated people are quarantined. And all we are saying in this case, and your lordship has said it quite clearly and asked the question as well, is why in the circumstances should just unvaccinated people be placed in forced quarantine?
So that's Dr. Darling. What else do you rely upon in relation to the issue of compliance with quarantine, home quarantine versus government mandated quarantine? So that's Dr. Darling.
Yeah, my lord, I would say with respect, in large part, that the observations, because I have Dr. Assaran as well, for instance, if we look at Dr. Assaram's affidavit.
It's in relation to the reply affidavits.
Yes, the first affidavit of Dr. Assaram.
Okay, and first affidavit. So what? Just tell me what's Dr. Assaran's qualifications in relation to this area?
My lord, she is, well, this is I'm obliged to your lordship for asking this. So if we look at this, she has a little bit more significant involvement with regard to the area as relates to COVID. And your lordship will see that she's a general practitioner, but she had experience, this is paragraph 3, was appointed the clinical director of long-term care and was responsible for managing the COVID-19 outbreaks in our rest homes.
Yes.
Facilities. She served as the clinical lead, the supervisor of Bermuda's National Southside COVID-19 testing site. In that capacity, she had conduct of thousands of the swabs for 19 testing and supervised tens of thousands. Additionally, she's also performed hundreds of rapid antibody tests. So there's no question, my lord, that clearly in working in the area that she has knowledge, firsthand knowledge with regard to the spread of the disease, that all would go along with that. And she has, paragraph 5, my lord, managed patients in our community for COVID-19 on a daily basis.
So which part of the affidavit you rely upon in relation to the specific issue which we are dealing with at the moment?
Just to hold on. Well, Lord, paragraph 8, she says that the vaccination does not and will not prevent emergence of variants. This is a common course with regard to microorganisms. I think that's it.
Ms. Perry, let's concentrate on the issue. And the issue we're talking about is home quarantine versus government mandated quarantine. In relation to that issue, just show me what you say is the relevant bit of the evidence.
Paragraph, it was the next paragraph following on from that. I was leading into it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which one is that?
Paragraph 9, my lord.
Yes.
The quarantine of only unvaccinated persons will not prevent emergence of variants of cases. Vaccinated persons have displayed symptoms, contracted COVID-19, and have transmitted same. Some of the most recent cases in Bermuda are fully vaccinated individuals who are free to roam the country from day one of arrival to Bermuda, provided they have negative pre-arrival and arrival tests. I think that's something of a prophetic statement, my lord, given what transpired today. But I think that's based on her first.
How is that evidence consistent with the paragraph 8 of Dr. Weldon's affidavit, which we've just seen? That nobody who has been fully vaccinated, who's been infected, has transmitted the disease to anybody.
Well, my lord, I would say it's not inconsistent. I think she says that since the date of was it May the 6th, something like that.
Yes.
So I mean that's a period of time of 2 months. It hasn't happened. I mean, it doesn't mean that there's not the risk of it happening. I think that would be a fair statement. It doesn't mean that risk doesn't exist. Or even the study, again, coming back to the
scientific. You accept, and the study seemed to show that the risk is substantially lowered.
I do accept that, my lord.
Yes.
And one can't speak against that. The risk is substantially lowered. The key point for consideration is that there is a risk. that there's a risk?
Well, in health management, health management on a national basis, one is not dealing with theoretical risks. One is dealing with real life substantial risks. I mean, you can work on the basis of what are substantial risks and fashion policies around it, not based upon theoretical risks.
Yeah, again, my lord, I would say that why have we cited, when I say we, why has the government cited all of these other countries and the approaches they've taken with regard to quarantine, if they weren't acknowledging that there must be a risk from vaccinated people being able to catch and to transmit the virus?
Well, I mean, we don't know the reasoning because we don't have those studies in front of us. I mean, if we had those schemes in front of us, had the rationale before us, we can discuss it. I mean, what if arguments are, only go so far? We're dealing with specifically that issue as to why it is that the government has taken the view that they will only quarantine non-vaccinated people. And the reason for that is we've had the scientific evidence. We had the evidence of, as I say, the Minister of Health, the Dr. Weldon, the Chief Medical Officer, and it's backed by scientific studies which say why it is that it's sensible to take the view that only non-vaccinated people ought to be quarantined. And what I'm looking from you is evidence which I should take into account, which should lead me to the contrary view. Well,
with respect, my lord, I think that from the doctor that I have just made mention of, that paragraph 9 is her evidence that is evidence of a contrary view to the position that you've indicated.
With home quarantining and government quarantining?
I'm sorry, my lord. I'm sorry, my lord.
How is that different?
How is that different?
Why do you say that helps you? The paragraph in here.
Well, I think, my lord, what it does is she's highlighting as a medical practitioner, as a doctor, that distinction is not going to prevent the prevent the spread of the virus. That there's still that risk that people that are vaccinated will contract and will pass on the virus. I mean, I can't really put it any higher than that.
Well, the scientific evidence, when I say scientific evidence, those people who actually done the studies, which are exhibited to the affidavits, people who have actually taken studies on a large number of people come to a different view.
They have come to a view, my lord, with regard to the fact that, as your lordship termed it earlier, that with regard to vaccinated people, the chances are greatly reduced, if you will. But there is still, I think we're adamant on this, there is still the risk, ergo, all of these other countries mandate everybody across the board.
Yeah, okay.
And to your lordship's point from this morning, in the red zones, everybody goes into, in the UK now, your lordship mentioned that report coming out, everybody goes into mandatory quarantine, vaccinated and unvaccinated. And that's on the basis of the science. And there reasonably is no type of division in Bermuda in that regard. It is just a question of, it doesn't matter. So what would happen, my lord, if I give this by way of example? As it stands right now, which I say is unreasonable. If you had a person that came in from India who was, and I think that's one of the accepted as one of the higher concerning regions right now. Somebody that came in from India that was vaccinated wouldn't have any particular protocol with regard to quarantine or anything compared to anybody else if they came from New York. Whereas an unvaccinated person coming in from the UK or New York would automatically go into a two-week quarantine. Whereas in the UK and other places, everybody would go into a quarantine.
So, okay, so we've gone through this. What else in terms of the evidence you rely upon?
My lord, I think it's important to consider the, well, I can address with regard to the comments I have with regard to the evidence of Dr. And
So far we have Dr. Dowling and Dr. Asaraya.
my lord, as far as the position that I see that your lordship is endeavoring is placing forward with regard to that, I would concede that there's no direct evidence to contravene the position of the scientific experts of the government as they relate to the severity of the disease itself, or the fact that people who are vaccinated have a lower risk of contracting the disease or transmitting it. Though it's certainly the case, as we have seen on the evidence, that they are able to contract it, and there is a risk that they can transmit the disease to others, albeit perhaps because of the load on a lower basis.
What about the incidence of compliance in if you are quarantined at home versus a government mandated facility? What expert evidence do you have on that?
My lord, the only expert evidence that is available on that relates to the evidence of Dr. Peden. Even the local experts don't speak to that. So, I mean, there are concerns that were raised by.
So we're only concerned with considering Dr. Peden's evidence on that.
Dr. Dowling's evidence on that.
Dr. Dowling's evidence on that.
Yes, I think that was Dr. Dowling spoke directly to the issue of. Oh, Dr. Dowling spoke to the issue of Dr. Peden's evidence. Yes. That's at page 4 of his affidavit. And those are observations of a medical practitioner with regard to what she has to say with regard to the position of quarantining at home and quarantining in a facility. I was going to actually address those, as your lordship said. These are some things perhaps that the council can even address. But if we wish, we can just look at what he observes, my lord, at page 4, paragraph 19.
Paragraph 19 to 22.
Yes, thank you, my lord. So he indicates that she admits at the outset of her affidavit that there is little scientific evidence regarding institution-based isolation and COVID-19. And there's certainly, my lord, as far as Bermuda goes, I mean, there's no study. The study that my learned friend cited relates to the Wuhan study. And if I may, it would appear that the main issue there was the inability to properly educate the public with regard to the measures they needed to take in adhering strictly to the COVID regulations to quarantine at home. That is significant in that we don't have that issue here. We have a position where all of those things can be imparted to the public through the media, through notices from the government. It's not a rural society, or it's not a place of millions and millions of people where there is a question of poverty, it would appear to be, was the concern, where people don't have the internet, where people aren't receiving the information. So Dr. Dowling—
Does he challenge, I see that he addresses Dr. Payton's affidavit opinion, expert opinion, paragraph 19 to 21. Does he actually challenge her conclusion, which is that, I think we looked at it yesterday, the conclusion is at paragraph 17 of Dr. Payton's opinion, and there she says, having reviewed the evidence on quarantine hotels and self-isolation at home, the evidence shows that the quarantine non-vaccinated people in quarantine hotels ensure stricter adherence. Does he challenge that opinion?
He doesn't challenge that opinion directly, my lord, but I am not, with the greatest respect, given what the position was in the UK, and her being a UK doctor, and how they are currently approaching things, I was at pains to understand exactly where on what model she was basing that opinion. It says evidence around behaviors shows that compliance with home isolation is low, but if that relates to the one report that's exhibited to her affidavit, my lord, on institutional, not home-based isolation could contain the COVID-19 outbreak, then there is not a lot of significant help that can be gleaned from that, as I say, because it relates to a Chinese study.
Well, there was a Chinese study, and then at tab 3 there was the Smith and Potts study, adherence to the test, trace, and isolate system in the UK.
Yes.
And
the position,
and she has expertise in this area.
But my lord, again, it wasn't a question of just quarantining people that are unvaccinated. I mean, it's about, certainly with regard to compliance, and I would make that point, my lord. It's not, and I said this yesterday, it's not just a question that we have to assume that because people choose for whatever reasons not to get vaccinated, that they're the naughty ones compared to those that are vaccinated, and then put them in a distinct class. There's always the risk that people that are vaccinated are having to follow the rules. There are rules that are still in place. There have been quarantine rules that are still in place, and there are quarantine rules that are in place in other countries. They still have to follow the rules. And the risk of
the executive making decisions to mitigate the risks of spread of COVID virus. I mean, they're not concerned with whether people are going to commit criminal offences or whether they're going to be negligent and the like. All their concern is to make sure that there is compliance with public health policies, and all they're concerned about is to make sure that if there is going to be quarantine, that the quarantine is complied with. Otherwise, there will be a spread of the virus. Yes. And they're not really concerned with effectively what the reasons are why quarantine is less effective in the home setting, be it because people just go out, be it because they will go out to work, they will go to a party, and be it that other people, the relatives come along or friends come along to the house and break the quarantine rules. But that's the reality, and it's the reality one has to look at. And it's not a question of imposing criminal sanctions and the like. And what she's saying is the evidence of Dr. Payton, as I see it, is that by the very nature of home quarantine, it's less effective than quarantine imposed, affected by a hotel, government mandated hotel, which is supervised. And that's, it accords with common sense that would be the case.
Yeah, my lord, I was just about to say, it's almost a commonsensical obvious point, isn't it? You know, if you lock somebody in a cell, by way of analogy, you know, and there's that type of high security, they're less likely to do something than if they're at home arrest, for example.
Yes.
I mean, is
and here, as I say, we've been through it before a number of times. Here we've got actually practical examples. We got the Minister of Health saying this is what happened in real life in relation to Bermuda and in relation to COVID-19.
It happened, my lord, and she gives a stark example of that from a year ago. But the question still has to be, with regard to these applicants I made, it still has to be a balancing act with regard to what is reasonable for the rest of the populace. I mean, it is direly unfortunate that one person, you know, breached those rules and may have had the impact that they did.
Well, if it did have that impact, let's just assume that it did have that impact that resulted in 21 deaths. That shows how serious the issue is and how serious the government has to take that issue.
Yeah, of course, if it did have that impact, I was as I say, I mean, May is a very risky thing, my lord. But we are where we are, and that happened over some time ago, before the time of vaccine. This has developed to where we're at this stage. We didn't have those provisions then, for whatever reason. I mean, the government didn't come along then and say, look what's happened here as a result of this. They knew about it, and we're going to quarantine everybody when they come in the door in a hotel. It begs the question, why not then and why now? And more importantly, it begs the question, if not then, why now and why to this measure of this severity where you're only dealing with unvaccinated people? And the question is that reasonable at this time?
Well, I must say, I thought you had, yesterday we had, I thought you had agreed with me that there was sufficient scientific evidence to distinguish between vaccinated and non-vaccinated for the purpose of quarantine, because they presented a radically different risk profile.
I had to concede that, my lord. There's no scientific evidence that says there is a different risk profile. That is the science. The question becomes as to how you reasonably deal with those people that for whatever reasons are unvaccinated. And what seems to have happened is now at this stage, there has been no glide up with regard to, I have a concern, my lord, that I am going to, the battery is going to run out. If I can just hang on the plug in. I'll just try to get plugged in.
Well, you better be quick, make your best points.
They're yet to come, my lord. One would hope. My lord, so that the point is that at this particular juncture, why have we suddenly decided to go as far as we have with this mandatory quarantine in a facility when it could be accomplished, as we've indicated, by and I'm coming back now.
It's really not that puzzling, is it? I mean, government says they had experience of house quarantining. It didn't work, and they say that it did not work. It wasn't effective. So they have come up with a different regime whereby it's a degree of supervision, government mandated hotels. I mean, that makes, why should it be puzzling when the government has experimented with house quarantine and has come to the view, has concluded that it did not serve the purpose, partly because of the incident with, no doubt, with that one person who infected so many people and potentially resulted in the deaths of 21 people. I mean, it's perfectly understandable that those who have the responsibility for public health might think about measures which are more stringent than they were in the context of simply home quarantining. It's just a logical step that you would think about something else.
Entirely agree with that premise, and I'm obliged for the way that your lordship has put it. But what has happened is it hasn't been a consideration and taking steps to ameliorate or address that position. What I would respectfully say, it's been a quantum leap of going from a position and a moving goalpost on when you're going to implement it, going from a position where you don't have to mandatory quarantine and pay for it because you are able to quarantine at home, to suddenly having to go to the position where you have to quarantine and pay for it in a hotel. That, with respect, is not what I would say is reasonable, and it's not taking reasonable steps in order to address the, albeit serious mischief, but in order to address that mischief. Why? Why suddenly at this stage would you have to go from 0 to 60, as the term says, if you could take other steps to glide up to that? If it was immediate concern, my lord, because somebody had been out and breached quarantine a month ago and 21 people had died, hands up. One could see where that was going to be a concern that had to be actioned immediately. That's not the case. We've gone from one position, which, home quarantine in large part, let's look at it this way, we haven't had a rash of prosecutions in relation to people breaking home quarantine. In fact, there's been none. So it hasn't been like people that are quarantined are running all over the place because they'd have been prosecuted and fined and dealt with and highlighted. That hasn't happened. We've gone from the position where the quarantine that is in place at this particular stage in time seems to be working. We seem to have ameliorated the position where we're moving towards herd immunity. In other words, things are getting better. Why would we take such a significant step with regard to what I say is excuse me, Lord, I'm just trying to get this plugged in, a very serious move to quarantine unvaccinated people only?
Yeah.
That's the thrust of it.
I took you out of your schedule, so you make the points you want. It's 4:05 now.
So, okay, I'm plugged in, so I'm not going to lose my best points by going by having suddenly go offline. My lord, I think we should come back then, because I think the points that I can build in around are around the Scottish minister's case.
Yes, 105.
105. And again, my learned friend and I are really ad item, I have to say, on a lot of the law that surrounds this. It's the application of it that we say is not reasonable in the circumstances. And as
so I can take the law from Mr. Duncan, and we just take the law from Mr. Duncan.
Well, I wouldn't say take the law from Mr. Duncan. I'm saying that we are ad item on a lot of the law. It's the application of the law.
Well, it's quite important to understand where you disagree.
I'm pardon?
It's quite important that I understand where you disagree, so I can rule on it.
Oh, well, we clearly disagree on the basis that the government action is constitutionally reasonable.
No. The legal principles. The
legal principles and the application of that, my lord. I don't see that we have a significant disagreement at all.
Good.
It's the application, as I say, of those principles to the current situation.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Lord. So at 105, my lord, in citing the Court of Appeal in R and the Friends of Antique Cultural Treasures Limited, my lord, one, the decision maker has a margin of appreciation or discretion which is highly fact and context specific. The evaluation will take account of all relevant circumstances, including conditions prevailing at the time the decision was taken and the reasons given why less restrictive measures were rejected. Embrace that fully.
Yes.
Now, if at this point, because I note that the Premier said that there were certain elements that were considered that weren't seen as being practical. But one has to pause and raise the question there, is that fully the case? Because it's the fact of the matter that the regiment, I think this is agreed, the regiment were being used to do checks on people. The legislation did require that people have bracelets so that we know that where they are. Those things have been used, have been effective, one assumes, because there hasn't been the wrath of prosecutions in relation to them. They are less restrictive measures, in my submission, than incarcerating people in a hotel room. And it is unreasonable in our submission that those types of measures, to use your lordship's words, in taking steps to address the concerns, were not implemented before going to the full-blown unvaccinated is locked down for 2 weeks. One would assume, my lord, that the people that fall into the exemption category, and there are a few of those, they have to home quarantine, and that the measures with regard to their home quarantine, even though they're unvaccinated, are going to be implemented, whether it's by way of wearing a bracelet or whether it's by way of periodic checks and so on. There are fines in place for people that breach. The law is there for that. So all of those measures with regard to unvaccinated people quarantining at home, the ones that are exempt, we have those.
I mean, the Premier says that it's for the government to determine how best to allocate its resources. The government does not have the resources to deploy the regiment for this purpose, and in any event does not consider it an appropriate use of the regiment. Now, that
kind of lost on me, my lord, with great respect to the Premier, because that's what they've been doing all of this time, and I don't know that anybody has taken issue with that. Why would that, in a health crisis, in a health emergency, not be a valid use of the regiment? That's number one. But number two, the fact that they have actually been doing it.
But you saw the cases which I was taken to by Mr. Duncan in relation to the decision-making by the executive, which is dealing with issues of governance and issues of economic allocation, issues of taking advice, issues of making decisions in relation to conflicting advices, issues in relation to determining what is the best course of action when there are potentially 15 different courses. That in those circumstances, the court gives a very wide margin of appreciation or judgment to the government, and doesn't say, well, you say it's not a good use of the regiment to enforce quarantine, but I, as a judge of the Supreme Court, take a different view. I mean, all those cases say that that's not for me to say.
Concur with that, my lord, that is not for you to say. What it is for you to say is whether the actions, and again, we come back down to, it's a very, very fine line here. We're dealing with mandatory quarantine of unvaccinated people as opposed to vaccinated people, whether the actions that are taken are reasonably required in all of the circumstances at this juncture. That is the key question. Can your lordship boil it down with everything that's in the mix and everything that's being done and how we've arrived at this point and say, are those actions reasonably required? Just that you have to now, at this stage, go into mandatory quarantine. More lord, at 2, at paragraph 105, a measure will be disproportionate, and this is a word I embrace, and a question for your lordship to consider, if in all of the circumstances is disproportionate, if it is clear that the desired level of protection could be attained equally well by measures which were less restrictive. And certainly even on the evidence of Dr. Peden in her affidavit, there are those considerations with regard to, let's say, what transpired in China as to what the problems were that we would not have in Bermuda in being able to ensure that the desired level of protection was met. And I went through some of those yesterday, my lord, that just one step back from the mandatory quarantine of having somebody quarantine at home, that there are provisions in Bermuda that we currently have, and technology that we currently have that can effectively ensure that people quarantine at home. And I say that by way of bracelet tracking, by way of periodic checks and so on, and by way of addressing it through legislation with regard to fines and the like that impose stiffer penalties. And most importantly, contrary to Dr. Peden's evidence, not contrary to it, but in looking at it, that ability to get the message out to people to say, this is what you must do, especially as we near the promised land, especially as we're getting so close, that this is what you must do because we're nearly at herd immunity. And if you do not, then these other really serious penalties that will follow from that.
This is what the sworn evidence of the Premier is. He says at paragraph 6, when considering the imposition of a mandatory hotel quarantine on unvaccinated travellers, there was consideration of alternative proposals. For examples, at-home quarantine with regimen checks or monitoring electronic bracelets. I consulted cabinet colleagues together with the Minister of Health, the Chief Medical Officer, the Governor, and the Minister of National Security. I was advised on specific examples of breach of at-home quarantine from the Minister of Health, as well as the scientific information about how much more effective hotel quarantine is compared to at-home quarantine, which is considered in the expert report of Dr. Peden. And he says, after wide-ranging consultation, the government considered the alternatives to the hotel quarantine mentioned above to be both impractical and ineffective for the following reasons. And then he gives the reasons. I mean, how, in light of all that, given that he says, this is not a case where they didn't consider these alternatives. He says, we considered those alternatives. We discussed it internally throughout with all the relevant government ministers and officers, took expert advice, and concluded that they were impractical. And he gives up all the reasons there. I mean, on what basis I can say you didn't do it, that you didn't consider the other alternatives, or that I conclude that your decision that there was no other way of achieving this is completely wrong.
Well, thank you, Lord. Work back from that. You wouldn't say it was completely wrong with respect, and nobody, and I certainly wouldn't invite your Lordship to say you're completely wrong on this. All that we're asking is that your Lordship would look at it and say, in all of the circumstances, and given again the stage that we're at, what has transpired, and the position with regard to vaccinated, unvaccinated, it's not reasonably required. It's a reasonable test. It wouldn't be for your Lordship to impose a position of saying you got this totally wrong. It's just that your ultimate conclusion that people have to, who are unvaccinated, must pay to quarantine in a hotel.
But he says that all the other measures were impractical and ineffective, i.e. didn't achieve the purpose.
Well, with respect, my Lord, there's no evidence of that, to quote my lawyer friend. There's no, he says that, but ergo, one would expect to see there would be prosecutions that would flow from that.
No, Mr. Pettingill, we do have evidence. We have evidence from the Minister of Health, who actually gives the evidence of past history. That is the best evidence you can have.
My Lord, the problem with that is it goes back significantly before the time of vaccination. That's what that evidence goes back to. And that's why it begs the question when it comes to reasonableness, why didn't you do it then if it was so reasonable to do it? Why have you waited till now when we have the vaccine? So it's if you had the situation, my Lord, where you could say and point to the evidence and say, here is an example of where a person refused to be vaccinated. They were supposed to be quarantined. They had the option to get vaccinated, since May or whenever, and they have caused these breaches, and they have done this. That would be different evidence to going back over a year before the time of vaccine and saying there was this quarantine breach. It's not. It should surely it has to be current. It has to be current by the imposition.
Yes. Is there any specific evidence you rely upon in under this head, i.e. alternative, less intrusive means? Do you actually have any evidence, or you just simply rely upon your argument?
No, my Lord, I rely actually on the evidence of the existing provisions. And I say that because currently the government has the ability, and this is on the admission of approach, and it's in the regulations. They have the ability to put people on ankle bracelets or on bracelets. Sorry, they have the ability to track. They have the ability to do all of these things. I mean, that is evidence of what.
Just pausing there. The Premier says that is ineffective. paragraph 6 of his sworn evidence.
Right.
So I should say what? In that, I know you've said this, that you've consulted people. You take the view that using electronic bracelets would not work, but we take a different view.
Well, they've been doing that since 2020, my lord. I realize that he said that with regard to it, but that is what they are doing. And there's no evidence to say that these have been the breaches with regard to the electronic monitoring devices. So I don't know if that's a question of costs or what it is, but we know and we can see that that's contained within the regulations. Why do they have it in there if it's ineffective? I mean, that's in the recent regulations. If you don't go into quarantine because you fall into an exemption position, then you have to have a bracelet on. I mean, I don't know why they would have it logically in the legislation that they passed. I mean, it's diametrically just opposed to that position. You've got it in there because obviously you're using it and you think that it's effective. I mean, it's just contrary. The legislation is contrary with respect to what the Premier is saying there. They're making use of it. And they should continue to make use of it. Then what we're saying is they should just make use of it in relation to people quarantining at home.
Well, just on the bracelets, how does that work when people just come to visit you?
Well, that one, my lord, is again, I had indicated, and one of the regulations for the 2020.
Sorry, just can you just answer me? I mean, how does bracelets?
It doesn't come to visit you, but it's kind of like the same. If somebody's quarantined in the hotel and their girlfriend or the boyfriend want to get in to see them, they're going to climb a balcony or find a way. That keeping them in the hotel isn't necessarily going to stop that either. I confess it may be more effective than just being at home. But what we would say in looking at the Scottish minister's case, that there are other less restrictive measures that could be put in place to address that, like by way of fine, saying if you have a notice to say that this house is under quarantine. This is an age-old approach, medieval approach, really. If you have a notice to say this house is quarantined and you enter and breach that, you're subject to, a significant fine. And that is not that's not a rocket science solution. And it certainly is a deterrent if a person knows they're going to cross the quarantine line and face a $10,000 fine. A reasonable solution that is a less restrictive measure than going with the mandatory hotel quarantine.
Yes.
Simple as that. And a fair consideration. And my lord, the case law speaks to that the measures, and that is a perfect example of a measure I'm speaking to that is simple, easily understood, and can be managed and supervised, I would say, because you're giving that indication. It's a simple fix to the very valid question that your lordship raises there. And I would say this: one has to proceed on the assumption that the majority of people will be law-abiding, and that certainly those that may be tempted, if they're made clearly aware that they're subject to a serious fine or serious imposition of legal constraints, that they're going to abide by that. My lord, unless I can be of further assistance, and your lordship has any questions for me, I don't have anything else I think I used to address.
No, I think you've answered all the questions I had.
I've tried to.
Anything further from you, Mr. Duncan?
But yeah, one thing that I think I should contextualize is the fact that memories fade, but you'll recall that as a result of the serious outbreak, it was in April, I think, that we were in lockdown.
Yes, it wasn't a year ago. It was a few months ago.
It was a few months ago, and as a consequence of that, it's clear that the decision that we are now facing in this challenge was the basis for the proposed order. And the reality is that context is important. And you'll recall that the challenge that is being made is to a decision, I correct myself, statement or a comment on the 7th of May. So the sequence is clear. In lockdown, as a consequence of that outbreak, remember, schools were closed. I mean, it was a complete lockdown. And the government exercised its policy-making decisions and decided to implement this.
Yes.
Implement this policy, and then you have the statement on the 7th of May. The last thing I say, my lord, is this, and I don't want to keep hammering this point, but we are challenged as to how in practice you can make a declaration against a comment from a minister that isn't even the minister in respect of this particular ministry. And we just think that there's some difficulty there. Obviously, no application was made to amend, and so we just have to leave it there. My case is closed, and I think my friend has closed his case with no application to amend.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for your arguments and your help. I'll obviously have to consider those, and I will let you have a judgment as soon as I'm able to do that.
Thank you, Lord.
Thank you, my lord.
Thank you. So this hearing is now concluded.
My lord.